Who's there?
Stop! Mother Miranda!
Hey! Who was... What was that?
Mother Miranda is the most powerful and important threat that Ethan Winters will encounter during the events of the game Resident Evil 8 Village. The most prominent figure in the entire region, Miranda has been shaping the community of the village to her own twisted needs for nearly a century by the time Ethan stumbled into their midst. Wielding superhuman abilities and vast knowledge bestowed upon her by her black god, the megamycete, Miranda would rule over her cult-like Eastern European village, all while attempting to find a suitable vessel for her long-lost daughter, Eva.
The megamycete catalogs all of us. However, she will be reborn as my daughter.
She's my child, not yours. Where are you?
The story of Mother Miranda as we know it begins a long time ago in the year 1909, with the birth of her first and only daughter, which she would name Eva. From the moment that she laid eyes on her precious baby girl, Miranda had lived her life in service to her pride and joy. It was the happiest that Miranda had ever been, or ever would be. However, fate had other plans for the beaming new mother. In 1919, when the epidemic of the Spanish flu was at its height, the disease would ravage a small village in which Miranda and her daughter lived. Eva would become infected, and at the mere age of 10, would succumb to her illness. This loss would understandably obliterate the once happy mother, and in her despair, Miranda would seek comfort in the only place where she knew she could find it: death. On the outskirts of the village, Miranda would stumble her grief-stricken soul into a cave to find a quiet place to end her life, so that she could once again reunite with her beloved daughter. However, inside the cave, Miranda didn't find the peaceful respite that she had anticipated. Inside, she found a cavernous opening in the earth, and at the center of that opening was an unfathomably large fungal root, a fungal super colony, which she would later dub the megamycete. Approaching the large mold-riddled object, Miranda touched the black substance covering its body, and when she did, it filled her with immense knowledge which instilled in her a new reason to go on living. From the megamycete, Miranda learned that it was possible to bring her daughter back from the void of death. Learned that this strange fungal root could break down and absorb the consciousness of those who had perished, and that if she could but find the right vessel, with the power of the megamycete, she could bring back what this world had so cruelly taken.
The dreams really can come true. Vessel or not, I can't wait to see my true child again.
Infused with new purpose, Miranda left the cave and returned to the village, bringing with her vials of mold from the megamycete to use on the unsuspecting people of the region. With the Spanish flu still ravaging the area, and the people searching for any glimmer of hope that they could find, when Miranda came to them with a cure, they were desperate to receive it. Telling the people that she was a prophet for the Black God, she injected them with the megamycete's mold, and as this magic mold seemed to cure those afflicted, they began to worship Miranda as a savior. However, the truth was far more sinister. Miranda wasn't interested in saving the region, far from it. Instead, she was merely using her magical cure-all as a conduit through which to control them. And with everyone in the region coming to her for answers to their ailments, it provided her with all the test subjects that she could ever need to find her daughter a perfect vessel. For decades, Miranda controlled the region under the guise of being their savior. They called her Mother, and thought of her as something of a deity. In the shadows of the village, Miranda would continue her research. She created a parasitic nematode, which she called a cadeau, using it as a means by which to test a person's ability to bond with the megamycete, a way to see if they would make a good host for her daughter. Trials with this newly created cadeau were widely varied. Some died shortly after being injected, having almost no affinity to bond with the megamycete. Others with slightly higher affinity would transform, the cadeau giving them a form of what appeared to be lycanthropy, becoming feral beasts that Miranda would send to live in an abandoned medieval fort on the outskirts of the village. And every so often, very rarely, her test subjects would ascend. Be it luck or some kind of genetic ability, the most promising subjects that Miranda would have during her research would be descendants of the four kings who'd established this region long ago. Salvatore Moreau, Donna Beneviento, Alcina Dimitrescu, and Karl Heisenberg would be the pinnacles of her experiments with the cadeau. But even though they showed remarkable promise, in the end, none of them were a fit vessel for Miranda's daughter. But still, they were strong allies nonetheless, and so she placed them in her council, calling them her children and entrusting them to aid her in control of the region.
I've heard all your arguments. Some of you were less persuasive than others, but I've made my decision. Heisenberg, the man's fate is in your hands.
Mother Miranda, I must protest. Heisenberg is but...
Throughout the decades, Miranda would continue her research, at one point in the 1950s, meeting and working with a man named Oswell E. Spencer. But when it was determined that their interests were misaligned, they parted ways. Spencer taking away inspiration from the two's meeting and going on to help found the pharmaceutical giant Umbrella. It wouldn't be until the year 2000 when a major leap forward in her research would come from a black market organization known as the Connections. Through undisclosed means, the criminal syndicate had been made aware of Miranda's experiments in Eastern Europe, and would reach out to her in an attempt to reach a mutually beneficial relationship. The Connections were seeking to make a bioweapon that was capable of neutralizing enemy combatants en masse without direct conflict, and thought that Miranda's mold could be the perfect means by which to achieve what they sought. In return for her help, they would create this bioweapon in the likeness of her daughter, using Eva's DNA to try and replicate the now long deceased child. However, unfortunately for Miranda, this research would be yet another dead end. The child looked like her daughter, yes, but it still wasn't the true Eva. And so, in disappointment over the results, Miranda parted ways with the Connections, and returned to her life in the village. That is, until 2021, when Miranda would learn some interesting information about the Connections mold experiment. After she'd left her black market colleagues, they'd lost the child created with Eva's DNA. The girl, which had been named Evelyn, had managed to take over a household down in Louisiana, taking captive the family that lived there, and more importantly, a woman whom Miranda had met during her involvement, Mia Winters. During her captivity, Evelyn had infected Mia with her mold, and when Mia's husband had come to save his imprisoned wife, he too had undergone a mold infestation. Evelyn had been subsequently killed by Mia's husband, Ethan. But what truly fascinated Miranda about the story was that a few years after their escape, the two had conceived a baby girl, Rose Winters.
There you go, sweetheart. Don't you worry. I'll be right downstairs. Daddy won't let those weird fairy tale monsters get you.
Either through sheer intuition or the thought that two mold-infected beings would create a more stable mold host, Miranda became convinced that this child would be the perfect vessel for her lost daughter. Through a mole in the BSAA that was associated with the connections, Miranda learned of where Chris Redfield had hidden the couple away, and immediately she began making plans to infiltrate. On Wednesday, February the 3rd, Miranda would make a request to a loyal villager named Eugene, asking him to bring her medical equipment and drugs, and in the days that followed, she would go about enacting her plans. Miranda would abduct Mia, bringing her back to the village to run some tests and assimilate her DNA so that she could assume her life and get close to Rose. She would then travel to the Winters' home with this new identity, and due to some marital issues that Ethan and Mia were having at the time, as well as some pretty convincing acting by Miranda, Ethan was unable to discern that his wife was an imposter. However, before Miranda was able to take the child, her ruse would be uncovered by Chris Redfield and his counter-bioterrorism unit, who had been keeping tabs on Miranda ever since they learned of her involvement in the Dulvey, Louisiana incident. The team would converge on the Winters' house one night while the two were eating dinner. And after seemingly killing the imposter Mia, Ethan, Rose, and Miranda were loaded onto trucks to be taken to an undisclosed location.
Chris? What the hell?
Sorry, Ethan.
No! What? Why?
Unfortunately for Chris and Ethan, however, Miranda's death was only a facade. Taking on the characteristics of a corpse to fool Chris's unit, she would attack the truck of soldiers during transit, kidnapping Rose in the process and returning to the village. In the early hours of Tuesday, February 9th, less than a week after telling Eugene to bring her medical equipment and drugs, she was using them on Rose. Miranda held a ritual with the four lords of the village, using the tools brought to her by Eugene to crystallize the child's body and split her into 4 pieces, giving one to each of her lords for safekeeping until the ritual could be prepared. With the child now safely in her custody, Miranda no longer had need of her village lab rats, and so she freed her lichened subjects to kill everyone in the village save for one. Having survived Miranda's attack on the soldier's truck, Ethan Winters had managed to make his way into the town, and either through pity or curiosity, Miranda had allowed him to live, even calling off her forces when they had him dead to rights, and speaking with him while in disguise as an old hag. Throughout Ethan's time in the region, Miranda would keep close tabs on her interesting guest, applauding him in secret as he managed to take down the 4 lords that she'd entrusted with the pieces of Rose. However, as the day wore on, and he managed to defeat all of her champions, he began to outlive his usefulness. And once he'd managed to bring down Heisenberg, Miranda's biggest threat, she decided it was time to deal with him before he could become any more of a nuisance. And so, with all of her loose ends seemingly tied up, Miranda made her way to the ceremonial site, preparing to use the giant's chalice containing Rose to finally revive her lost daughter. It had been a century since Eva had been taken from her. Countless lives had been sacrificed in pursuit of her resurrection, and now it was going to pay off. Finally, she'd be able to see her beautiful daughter again. Finally, she'd get to hold her precious child. However, there was one factor that she hadn't accounted for. One thing that she hadn't calculated into her plans. The resilience of the family that she'd infiltrated and attempted to destroy. The resistance of the Winters.
Miranda!
Interesting. Your body certainly isn't normal.
Give Rose to me! Now!
You will see. Once I kill you properly,
Get her now!
and you try to take it away from me. I will take what is due.